Arvid Lindblad's been granted a super license, Callum Nicholas is out there saying he wouldn't be surprised if Max Verstappen retires at the end of the season, and Peter Bayer's not keen to bow down to the overbearing parent and let go of Isaac Hadjar. There comes a point where you need to accept that Red Bull, unfortunately, kind of just, well, they always make for a good storyline, don't they? Kia ora, my name's Kimmy and I talk about Formula One in the world's second worst accent, and today we're going to have a bit of a chat about Red Bull's driver situation and what that might mean for 2026 and beyond. Now there's a few different scenarios that might play out here. Some are pretty pedestrian, others will cause a bit of silly season chaos, but the underlying thread through all of it is that Red Bull has put themselves in a position where, apart from one potentially prodigal prospect, that's a lot of alliteration, good lord, they've not got a lot of drivers coming up through the ranks who are bashing out the kind of results that meet Helmut Marko's often unreasonable expectations. Pepe Māori fans, please don't come at me, and no, I haven't forgotten about Ayumu Iwasa. Now this season things have been pretty rocky. We've had Liam Lawson's two-race cameo for the top team, Yuki Tsunoda being made to look like Checo 2.0, Max Verstappen on the verge of a race ban, and Isaac Hadjar, to many fans and pundits alike, surprise, looking a bit like a shoo-in for Rookie of the Year. Red Bull have just one more driver they're able to put in the car before they reach their limit for the season, and Arvid Lindblad's just been granted a super license at the ripe old age of 17 under special dispensation. Now up until this point in the year, Red Bull have effectively been running without an official reserve driver. Yes, they could call up Ayumu Iwasa in theory, but he's currently competing in Super Formula in Japan. He's also, despite his Wikipedia page indicating otherwise, no longer an official Red Bull Junior according to Red Bull's website. It appears he's in some kind of limbo state, mostly backed by Honda, but still with a tenuous association with Red Bull while the Honda engine is still in the cars. So, first I'm going to go through the main prospects for the future and where they're at with their quest for a super license. At the moment, Red Bull has 4 drivers currently competing in Formula 2 and Formula 3 who, in theory, would be the next guys on the list for Helmut Marko to give the hurry up on the super license front now that they've got the okay from the FIA for Lindblad. Those 4 are Pepe Māori, Oliver Goethe, Tim Tramnitz and Nikola Tsolov. Now there's no formal list of super license points status published online from the FIA, as it's got a lot of moving parts and it isn't a hard and fast just get the points and get the license kind of thing. But based on some quick maths and without looking into things like season total penalty points, here is very roughly where they're all at. Marty currently sits somewhere around 28 points, however 26 of those will expire at the end of this season. He currently sits 7th in the F2 Championship, and it's still a pretty tight field, so after 6 weekends he's only 30 points behind his 3rd place teammate Lindblad. Now with F2, any position in the top 3 come the end of the season, you get enough points to apply for a license. Goethe has around 27 points, again with a large chunk of these dropping off at the end of the season. He's currently 13th in F2 and will need a miraculous turn in form to finish the season over the line. Tramnitz is probably on around 18 points. He's currently 3rd in the F3 Championship, so if he can finish 1 place higher in the standings, he'll hold enough points. Now that place is currently held by Tsolov, who's in his 3rd season of F3, which normally is kind of a bit of a bad sign and like, you know, red flag, but he's still only 18 and he's the youngest out of all of the guys Red Bull has coming up, barring Lindblad. Tsolov probably has around 12 points thanks to winning the F4 Spanish Championship in 2022. So these are points that will also drop at the end of the season, which means if he does make the step up to F2 next year, and even if he wins Formula 3, then he'll only be able to drive FP1 sessions unless Red Bull sends him down under to compete in Formula Regional Oceania like they did with Lindblad at the start of this year. So with so many of Red Bull's junior team with points dropping off at the end of 2025 or not really having any hope of the required 40 points for a super license, I think it's likely we'll see a bit of a shootout all the way down here in Aotearoa this Southern Hemisphere summer. It would be smart for Red Bull to support as many of these guys as possible to cross the super license threshold, because once you've got it, it's just about maintaining it. But then they're probably also looking pretty hard at poaching someone else's academy driver. Now, as a lover of spreadsheets, this is exactly the kind of data that I enjoy digging into. So if you'd like me to start working on a points tracker, then let me know. At the moment I do have limited time as I have a job and a couple of side hustles, but there are ways that you can support me to be able to focus more on F1 content and analysis. You can subscribe to my channel, you can like my videos and you can watch them to the end, or if you're keen to directly support me, then the link to my Patreon is down in the description and here on the screen. I am hoping to offer some exclusive benefits to my patrons sometime in the near future. However, at the moment, your support just comes with a special thanks, and you can become a free member as well if you just want to get an email when I post a new video. All right. Over. So what are the three main scenarios that I see playing out with the 4 Red Bull seats? The first, and I think the most likely, is that Isaac Hadjar gets a crack in the Red Bull next to Max Verstappen, Tsunoda drops back down to Racing Bulls, and Lawson is relegated back to reserve in favour of Arvid Lindblad, who'll take a seat alongside Yuki. Now, all of this obviously is tangled up in the politics of the Red Bull-Honda deal dissolving at the end of the year. However, despite Honda's push to get Yuki his promotion earlier this season, there hasn't really been the same chatter about a drive to get him a place in the Aston Martin garage, and considering Honda has essentially told the media that Yuki's on his own now, I think that relationship is set to come to its natural conclusion at the end of 2025. Now, Red Bull would be smart to retain Tsunoda, as he's a very capable set of hands who's taken a bit of a hit in the most sort of shocked Pikachu kind of way. The second scenario that I can see happening is that Red Bull drops Tsunoda back to reserve, either drops Lawson entirely or has him as a second backup. They have Hadjar and Lindblad in the Racing Bulls, and then they recruit an outside hire into the second Red Bull seat. Now, with the current contract status of F1 drivers and with Red Bull's need for someone with experience who's still relatively young, the only real option here is George Russell. And yes, F1 contracts are made to be broken, and maybe Charles Leclerc finally has enough and extricates himself from the horrors, or Nico Hülkenberg decides Audi's not the place he wants to call time on his career and Red Bull just wants to plug a gap, or Mark Webber decides he'd rather have Oscar Piastri working for the devil he knows and still plays nice with on the regular, but the reality is Red Bull's best option right now is George. Which means they need to have a good, hard, long look at why they decided not to give Carlos Sainz a contract last year and interrogate whether or not those reasons were the right ones. And yeah, sure, George and Max have a whole lot more beef than Max and Carlos, who certainly seem to get along pretty well nowadays, now that they're not both young adults and they don't really need the guidance of their fathers anymore. But it's naive to think that the reasons they didn't pick Carlos and the reasons they might not approach George don't have a pretty big overlap in the Venn diagram of trepidation. It's not quite a circle, but it's close. The third scenario is the nuclear one that leaves Red Bull up you-know-what creek without a paddle. Max has enough and decides to either leave for another team, retires, or decides to take a sabbatical, which is looking less and less of a crazy concept. Last year I would have said it's bonkers for Max to throw in the towel with Red Bull after 2025. The 2026 regulations are a big unknown. Plenty of teams have problem with both wind tunnel and CFD correlation, and it's possible that some of the rumours that have been going around about how the teams are developing are all a bit of a red herring. These are organisations that trade in half-truths and semantics to hide advantages after all. But as this season goes on, and as the talk of there being a wide field spread next year gains more and more traction, teams' issues with getting down to the weight limit thanks to the additional chonk of the power unit, and the more clear it becomes that this regulation cycle, and particularly the engines, might not be long for this world, I think the idea of Max perhaps not retiring but taking a little break for a few years to see how things shake out is becoming more and more likely. And I think what he did in Spain is the first really big indication that Red Bull's problems are really starting to get to him. Max knows the rule book, Max will know exactly how many penalty points he's on, but he drove into the side of George anyway. So what happens if Red Bull's without Max next year? And what if he does a Nico Rosberg and doesn't call time until after it's all over? The thing is, Max is a loyal guy. That's one consistent thing people say about him over and over, so even if an announcement doesn't come until season close, it's unlikely that Red Bull wouldn't be aware of his decision well prior. So we go back to George. The longer George Russell doesn't have a Mercedes contract extension, the more likely it is we'll see him in a Red Bull this year. And I would also say keep a very, very close eye on what he says when asked questions about Mercedes 2026 development. And next to him, I think realistically we go back to scenario number one, just with George in place of Max. But I also Wouldn't be surprised if we see one of the McLaren drivers, depending on how much tension builds behind the scenes during the title fight. And between those two, I put my money on Oscar. Mark Webber is still associated with Red Bull. He'll know where they're at with their development, even if publicly he says he doesn't. And he's so embedded in F1, he's so knowledgeable, he's so experienced, that it's unlikely he hasn't put something in Oscar's contract that gives him an out. It might not be an easy one, it might come with a hefty price tag, but it'll be there. But even without two new recruits in the top team, even if Red Bull sticks within its own driver pool with the exception of George, this leaves Mercedes with a conundrum. And it more than likely would mean we see the return of Valtteri Bottas, provided Cadillac doesn't sweep in and snap him up first at least. So what do you think? Do you think Red Bull will stick with the status quo and go for stability next year? Do you think Max is going to string us along for another decade and keep threatening to retire, but he's still here in his late 30s with no break? And are you, like me, incredibly frustrated there isn't a database of current super license points? Let me know in the comments. Thanks once again to my patrons, and I'll see you in the next one. Is anyone else weirded out by how much Arvid Lindblad looks like Daniel Ricciardo, or is that just me?